Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the official book launch of the volume Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism. My name is Michael Rosenthal, and I'm the acting director of the Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, and I'm delighted to see so many people here today to join us for this interesting discussion. Much like this volume, this event is a collaboration between many institutions. The book launch is co-sponsored by the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto, and the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. Thank you to everyone at those institutions who have supported this event and made it possible. On behalf of all the sponsors, I'd like to say that we're excited to gather here today, albeit virtually, unfortunately. I wish we could be in person, but we're doing it via Zoom, to celebrate the launch of this important and timely scholarly volume. This volume, published by Palgrave Macmillan, is a collection of over 20 original essays by leading scholars in a variety of fields, addressing the question of what relevance a given concept has for our understanding of anti-Semitism. Given this extremely complex and essential task, Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, director of the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University in Berlin, had this to say about the volume. I quote her, "Finally, a comprehensive and innovative approach to a contested historical and political phenomenon. The editors break up the topic well into thought-out key concepts, while the authors in turn provide fresh perspectives on a wide array of entangled topics that are essential for understanding anti-Semitism. It's readable, insightful, and provocative, right? High praise. During today's program, you'll hear from each of our volume's editors and three of its contributing authors, Professors Doris Bergen, Jeffrey Kopstein, and Sara Horowitz. Today's launch, I think, promises to be reflective of the book itself, a deeply insightful, diverse, and packed-full discussion between leading scholars in their respective fields on the key concepts of the study of anti-Semitism. There's also going to be a question and answer period, which we'll encourage you all to participate in later in the program. So before introducing our first speaker in the volume, though, I'd like to encourage you all to purchase the book online at the Palgrave website. And you can check the chat today. So there's a chat feature in Zoom, of course. If you're not already familiar with it, you can click on it. And you'll find that there's a link to a special discount code to receive 30% off the book. So if you find this stimulating, I'm sure you will. Some of you might actually want to get the book, and I encourage you to do that with a discount. But now, to get things going, let me introduce one of the volume editors, Professor Kalman Weiser. Kalman Weiser is the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies and the Associate Director of the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. He specializes in European Jewish history and the language and culture of Yiddish-speaking Jews. He's the author of Jewish People, Yiddish Nation, Noah Prelucki and the Folkists in Poland, 2011, and co-editor of Chernowitz at 100, the first Yiddish language conference in historical perspective, an expanded and revised edition of Solomon Birnbaum's Yiddish, Survey and Grammar, and he's a contributor to the Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism, the volume that we're going to be discussing today. He's currently completing a book about the relationship between leading Jewish scholars of Yiddish and German colleagues who ended up serving the Third Reich. Please welcome Kalman Weiser to the screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to speak to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. It's my privilege to tell you something about the origins of this project. So I'll begin with my prepared notes. The initial impetus for Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism was a frustration shared by its editors, a frustration that we trust has been productively channeled. It is the culmination of a project with a long gestational period, about 7 years. I introduced a course about anti-Semitism at York University in 2005. This was a time of growing turbulence on many North American campuses related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I wanted to offer students something that would introduce them to the complex questions raised by the study of anti-Semitism and to help guide them and myself through the morass of contemporary debates about its past and its present. Like many in my field, I had received little explicit graduate training to teach such a course, despite anti-Semitism being a leitmotif in so much of the scholarly literature about Jewish history and culture. But I found teaching the course a profoundly disappointing, if not disheartening, experience. I felt that I was not getting through to my students. I was not challenging them to think in new ways about anti-Semitism, beyond disabusing some of them of the naive belief that it was the monopoly of Nazi Germany, or a phenomenon largely confined to the past, especially to the World War II era. Despite my best efforts to expand and complicate the picture, I was instead privileging the thesis that anti-Semitism was the oldest hatred, a unitary, internally coherent phenomenon that differed across time and space, primarily in its intensity. As such, it had inexorably culminated in genocide and was liable to explode again wherever Jews lived as a minority. If such was the message I was conveying, how could I justify my own existence teaching students, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who plan to live out their lives in Canada? Apart from my own shortcomings as an inexperienced teacher, the problem resided partly in the design of the syllabus, partly in the literature available for use in the classroom. Most of it was written by historians of the European Jewish experience like myself. The authors tried more or less successfully to relate hundreds, if not thousands of years of history and culture in distinct contexts for the benefit of students who had very little orientation in either world history or geography. It was simply overwhelming. Or, rather than drown students in details, they promoted an overly simple narrative, often one working backwards from the Holocaust as the paradigmatic model of anti-Semitism. There was little room for students to grasp nuance, to see hostility towards Jews as the product of diverse and changing factors, or to consider anti-Semitism in relation to other forms of hatred and bigotry. Out of frustration, I ceased teaching the course after a few years. That is, until my friend and colleague Saul Goldberg, a professor of religion and philosophy, introduced his own course about anti-Semitism at the University of Toronto. Attending Saul's weekly class exposed me to a different perspective on how to teach about anti-Semitism, one that focused on conceptual more than contextual approaches to its study. Saul, however, experienced a frustration similar to my own with the available literature and course design. We began collaborating, combining our disciplinary approaches to produce a jointly taught course. While we never taught this course, we did approach our old friend and colleague Scott Uri, a historian who had recently become the director of the Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism at Tel Aviv University. Scott experienced challenges both similar and different to ours. Most significantly, perhaps, he taught students, both Jews and Arabs, who were educated in a school system that prioritizes anti-Semitism as an integral part of Jews' historical experience, and in a state whose foundational ideology was born in part as a response to virulent anti-Semitism. Needless to say, the assumptions about anti-Semitism that Israeli students brought into the classroom were often quite different from those brought by their Canadian counterparts. In light of our varying experiences in and outside of the classroom, Scott, Saul, and I conceived of the present volume as an essential guide, an aid to faculty teaching courses about anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and bigotry, and as a guide for researchers seeking orientation in its major themes and controversies. We were able to realize this volume thanks to the contributions of an international group of scholars, as well as the generous support of the Canadian government and the sponsoring institutions present today. Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism is meant to offer a fresh look at anti-Semitism, one that emphasizes the mobility of concepts across time and space, rather than attempts to subordinate the unruly past and present to a single unifying narrative, or to limit its investigation to a single discipline. In the summer of 2018, we had the privilege of testing this approach at an intensive summer institute that we organized at York University for junior faculty and graduate students from around the world. Now that our volume is finally out, we hope to continue this collaboration between our universities and to make such an institute a regular event in Toronto. Now that I've said my introductory remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Scott Uri, who is the professor in the Department of Jewish History at the University of Tel Aviv University. He is also the director of the Bazin Institute for the Study of Historical Consciousness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Kalman and to Michael for starting off the evening or the afternoon or the morning, depending on where you are. Thanks also to Natasha and Julie and everyone else for getting this organized, Sebastian. And thanks to everyone else who showed up on screen. An amazing collection of people I don't know, old friends, new friends, and now we're off. So I will also read from prepared comments to keep it under the time limit and to keep things short, hopefully. So those of you who keep up with events in Israel will not be surprised if I start my comments today by noting that discussions regarding the sources and implications of anti-Semitism, are recurring topics in the news cycle in Israel today. Some of you may have heard Israel's current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, recent characterization of the International Criminal Court's potential investigation of Israel as being, quote, pure anti-Semitism. And others of you may have heard some ultra-Orthodox activists claim over the past few months that anti-COVID regulations designed to restrict religious gatherings and events are similarly anti-Semitic, or sometimes said in Israel and other circles, auto-anti-Semitic, Jewish anti-Semitic, etc. While such comments may seem extreme to some of you, they illustrate, I believe, the critical role that anti-Semitism and discussions surrounding it play in the Israeli public sphere, and also the impact that such debates often have on the way that anti-Semitism is understood, explained, discussed, and taught in Israeli universities, colleges, high schools, and even elementary schools. Now, while a personal interest in and strong opinions about anti-Semitism or any topic can often produce engaged classroom encounters, they can also lead to emotional, at times angry, confrontations between students and even among faculty. Is anti-Semitism, as seminal Zionist thinkers like Yehuda Lepinsker and Theodor Herzl maintained at the end of the 19th century, really an indelible part of European society? One that leaves Jews no choice but to embrace Zionism? Or were Jews integral parts of European and Middle Eastern societies in which they dwelled for centuries? Is criticism of the state of Israel motivated by, again, quote, pure anti-Semitism, quoting here my Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu? Or are critics of Israel's policies expressing heartfelt humanitarian concerns? Does the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism protect Jewish individuals and communities, or does it stifle debate regarding the ills of the nation state and the price of protracted conflicts? And as of this weekend, did the comedian Michael Shea perpetuate anti-Semitism as Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, charged in this weekend's edition of Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live? Or was he employing a legitimate form of political critique, satire? These are, as you can imagine, hot red button issues, and the inability of many students and even some faculty at Tel Aviv University and other locations to differentiate between political arguments regarding anti-Semitism and the scholarly study of the phenomenon convinced me of the need to create a framework that would help separate the scholarly study of anti-Semitism from angry or heated arguments that can often preempt discourse, exchange, and research. As Kalman noted a minute ago, the first step that we made in our early conversations and discussions in Tel Aviv was to create an apparatus or framework that would eschew or go around the chronologically oriented histories that often characterize studies of anti-Semitism by examining the phenomena through the prism of key concepts. Our hope was that focusing on specific concepts would disrupt the teleological tendency to view anti-Semitism as a long, continuous, and unique hatred, and in doing so, to sever the connection between anti-Semitism and contemporary ideologies that often depend upon specific historical interpretations of the phenomena. Although not intentional, at least not on my part, our turn to key concepts contributed further to our efforts to create a new framework by allowing us to employ an array of disciplinary approaches throughout the volume, and not only history. By reaching out to colleagues from a number of fields, philosophy and law, literature and religion, history and the social sciences, we were able to paint a far more nuanced composite of anti-Semitism, its past, present, and future. The turn to scholars grounded in a variety of disciplines leads to the third way that this volume encourages new thinking about anti-Semitism, and that's the diverse range of opinions that appear in the volume. Not only is there no single overarching argument, there's also no single approach to the topic, nor can there be, with 22 authors, 3 editors, and several external readers. The multivocal approach to the study of anti-Semitism was augmented by the dynamics of ongoing collaboration across countries and borders between the 3 co-editors, each with his own academic background, contemporary concerns, and thoughts regarding the volume. And the last way that this volume attempts to reinvigorate the study of anti-Semitism is its emphasis on pedagogy. As Kalman noted, we hope that breaking down the study of anti-Semitism to more manageable thematic modules of roughly 20 pages each would encourage their use in a wide array of university settings. Of course, time will only tell whether or not this volume will achieve some of its many goals. It's certainly my pleasure to conclude by noting how rewarding it has been to work over the past few years with Kalman, Saul, and the many different authors in this innovative, exciting, and challenging project. Thank you. Now I'm passing the mic, as it were, over to my friend and co-editor, Saul Goldberg. Is that right, Saul?
Thank you, Scott. So as previously mentioned, our project is the result of collaboration, not only among the volume's 3 editors, but also our home institutions. In particular, our academic units, the Anne Tanenbaum CJS at U of T, the Koschitzky CJS at York, and the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, were instrumental in helping us realize our plan, which, as Kalman mentioned, included 2 workshops and a summer school in addition to the volume. This kind of international cooperation is itself an accomplishment of which we're proud. I'm also grateful personally for the support behind this event. I'll join the thanks already given to Natasha and Sebastian in particular for their work, but I also want to say that it started really with Anna Sternches, who initiated the planning when she wrote to congratulate me on the book's release, which is actually how I found out that it had come out. And before I could even reply to the generous offer, Anna had written to Michael, who was just as encouraging as she was. Then Pamela Clausen, the chair of the Department for the Study of Religion, my other home unit, found out about the event, and she made a point of advertising it on several occasions. Their support really means a lot to me, so thank you, Anna, Michael, and Pamela. Since this event is meant to launch the book, and you've already heard about its origins and its past, I'm going to say something about my hopes for its future and how it will be received. I'm going to use the volume's title as a convenient way to orient my comments. Let me start with concepts. In many fields, like religious studies or literary studies, volumes that organize research and teaching by means of concepts have been de rigueur since the 1990s at least. I remember several volumes of these types as a graduate student. But not in the study of anti-Semitism, where for one reason or another, theoretical interventions have been resisted or inhibited. Kalman and Scott have already suggested that our volume differs from others in emphasizing concepts in the study of anti-Semitism rather than the context of anti-Semitism, where these are usually strung together in some grand narrative about its persistence across contexts. This narrative is not just the dominant theoretical approach in the study of anti-Semitism. It is essentially the only available one. So I hope that readers appreciate our effort to offer an alternative way to carve up the topic of anti-Semitism. Ideally, they'll also find that our conceptual approach provides more entry points into and flexibility within the study of anti-Semitism. But minimally, our volume challenges the monopoly of the narrative about anti-Semitism's trans-contextual endurance from ancient Egypt till today. Which concepts are key? We had many debates among ourselves. Although we still might not agree about each choice individually, the aggregate, I think we would all agree, accomplishes an important function. Some entries were no-brainers, right? The volume couldn't have gone forward without, say, chapters on anti-Zionism or Holocaust or blood libel. But the inclusion of some concepts like philo-Semitism, Orientalism, and Jewish self-hatred, which I wrote about, are probably obvious only to those deeply engaged in the topic. Whereas others, like secularism, conspiracy theory, and post-colonialism, are there explicitly to push the envelope. So my second hope is that readers will recognize that our key concepts not only reflect how anti-Semitism has been studied, but also invite a consideration of how else it could be studied. The last bit of the title, The Study of Anti-Semitism, seems probably to require no comment. But in my opinion, it conceals perhaps the most interesting debate that the volume might spark and did occur among its editors. The study of anti-Semitism, that phrase, contrasts implicitly with anti-Semitism studies. The latter, but not the former, takes an explicit stance about the existence of a field. Now, no one doubts that anti-Semitism needs to be studied. It's far from certain among scholars, however, whether its investigation should be constituted as an independent field of inquiry. The individual contributions to the volume imply different answers to this question, and we've negotiated this fundamental disagreement with the cagey phrase, the study of anti-Semitism. And even though we've been hesitant about putting forward the bolder claim about a field, one way or another, I think the volume gives readers the resources for assessing both the skeptical and affirmative answers to the question of anti-Semitism studies. It might be too much to say that the volume will be a game changer. Besides, I'm too much of a soft sell type to say that anyways, though I do hope everybody buys the book. I want to put my daughter through private school if I can. But since it's the first volume of its kind, it seems reasonable to hope for the volume both to spur novel ways of conceptualizing anti-Semitism and to facilitate a reconsideration of how discrete research questions about anti-Semitism might be organized. I don't know whether my co-editors share these exact hopes. If we aren't in perfect harmony, I wouldn't be surprised. As I've implied, the volume is the result of constructive disagreements and productive compromises among us. And I've learned a lot working with Scott and Kalman in a number of regards about the topic and the field. On certain points, however, I should say, we have been in complete agreement. And one such point is about the involvement of the other three panelists. Doris, Jeff, and Sarah began contributing to the project as interlocutors even before our plans materialized. And they've been with us at every step since then. It's only fitting that among all the volume's contributors, they would be participating in this event. Now, Doris, Jeff, and Sarah are all highly accomplished scholars who need no introduction. And that's good since time doesn't permit a proper introduction. I'll say only that you'll hear first from Doris Bergen, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Toronto, then from Jeffrey Kopstein, Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of California at Irvine, and finally from Sara Horowitz, Professor of Comparative Literature and Humanities at York University. And I'll just take this final opportunity to say thanks to all three of you for all your generosity and insights.
Thank you so much, Saul, for the introduction, and Kalman and Scott, all of you, for the privilege of being part of this project. Working together with all of you on the key concepts has made me look in new ways at a concept that I think about all the time, and that's the concept Nazism, which is what my chapter is about. Now, I anticipate that this book is going to have excellent reviews, and that every review is going to include the word timely. As I was preparing my comments, I thought about everything that's happened since Saul first asked me to be part of this project. Above all, I thought about the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. As a historian, the distance between past and present is important to me. But this project, with its approach of key concepts, really highlighted for me the essential linkage between past and present in understanding Nazism in relation to anti-Semitism. I formulated it like this, that Nazism persists as a symbol and synonym for a variety of anti-Semitism that is inseparable from genocidal violence against Jews. Because within, you could say, the shorthand of Nazism, the idea of destroying Jews merged with the power, right, of a state mobilized behind that goal, the possibility, and in fact, the reality of annihilation. Also important for my approach was the way that Nazism and anti-Semitism are intertwined processes that influenced and shaped one another. When I read through the whole book to prepare for this event, I discovered that this approach, anti-Semitism in relation to the key concepts as being embedded, entangled, intertwined, dialectically related, appeared in almost every single chapter. Here I'm just giving you the examples from the chapter on anti-Zionism, on conspiracy theories, and on gender. Those linkages, in my analysis, really create a kind of volatility, where in the case of Nazi anti-Semitism, both past and present, it feeded and fed on, was fed by racism, especially anti-Black racism. One of the things I learned in this project from Robert Bernasconi, you see the quotation there from his chapter, is that in fact the term racism came into common usage in English precisely connected to the biologically based anti-Semitism of Nazism. And for a contemporary manifestation of that, you could say, feeding on one another, one need look no farther than Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, where swastika flags merged with Confederate flags, where the anti-immigrant slogan, "You will not replace us," mutated into "Jews will not replace us," capturing the heady, potent, deadly mix of xenophobia, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. Historically, within Nazism, anti-Semitism provided an organizing principle that allowed competing people and projects to come together, and it serves that same function in the present. In this quotation from the German shooter in Halle, Yom Kippur, you can see Holocaust denial merging with anti-feminism, with xenophobia, and tying them all together, anti-Semitism. Also important in my chapter was to analyze the ways in which Nazism was not only in some way a product of anti-Semitism, but itself produced new forms and new expressions of anti-Semitism. You could see in the post-war period, maybe most obviously in post-war pogroms, the ways that greed, resentment, a bad conscience, desires to control the polity, looking ahead to Jeff's chapter, merged around anti-Semitism. But you can also see other forms. As I mentioned here, one of the legacies of Nazism, an image of Jews as eternal victims who not only attract suffering, but profit from it. And this kind of inversion, Jews as at the same time victims, the beneficiaries, and eventually also the so-called perpetrators of genocide, is really central to the persistence of Nazism as a kind of anti-Semitic expression at present. A bizarre expression of this comes from none other than Anders Breivik, whose name you'll recall from the 2011 murder of 77 people in Norway. In his lengthy manifesto that preceded his killing spree, Breivik initially claimed that he was not an anti-Semite, but in fact a fan, an ally of Israel, who he said was a supporter against Muslims. But even in that manifesto, Breivik's phrase referring to the paralyzing Jewish Holocaust religion pointed to the internal logic of his thought, a logic that connected extreme violence, anti-Semitism, racism, and Nazism, and that manifested in his first two public appearances, 2016 and 2017, where he appeared, and initially his first gesture was a Nazi salute. Thinking about the key concept of Nazism in relation to anti-Semitism is extremely important, as is the work of this whole book. But it's also, for lack of a better word, I would say sickening. Sometimes it literally makes me feel sick to take these words in my mouth. And the only antidote is to try to reverse the anti-Semitic gaze. This is what I've tried to do here with the reminder from Abram Joshua Heschel that it's racism that is the disease, or with the quotation from Toni Morrison that it's the racists, the anti-Semites, who are bereft. As she wrote, if you can only be tall because someone's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. The visual comes from Charlotte Solomon, a German Jewish artist who looked back at Nazi anti-Semites. Her fate is inscribed in her dates. This reversing the gaze doesn't defeat anti-Semitism, but it can fortify us to take on the challenge that this important volume represents. Thank you, and I turn the floor over to my friend and colleague, Jeffrey Kopstein.
Unmute. There I am. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful to be back in Toronto, virtually as it were. And I wanted to thank Saul, Scott, and Kalman for putting this volume together. When I first started collaborating with them on this, I thought it was, of course, intellectually fascinating, but I didn't realize how timely it would be. And sitting here in the United States in 2021, it's disturbing at just how timely it is. As many of you know, I've worked on the problem of pogroms for about 20 years now. And so the prospect of writing a chapter to summarize the relationship between pogroms and anti-Semitism was both inviting and daunting. 20 pages. So let me start with the kind of intellectual problem that I pose. And that, first of all, is what causes a pogrom? Under what conditions does it occur? This is a problem that has really plagued Jewish life really since antiquity, and really constitutes one of the most important things about Jewish life, that is the search for physical security. But as soon as we get into this problem, this question, two big problems assert themselves. First of all, what is a pogrom? It's useless to explain something why it occurs if we don't know what it is. And so I have a very simple definition. That's the outbreak of deadly violence against Jewish civilians. Now, sometimes it's neighbor on neighbor violence. That is, and that's what makes a pogrom in many ways, is that it's close and personal and intimate, if you will. The violence is intimate. But sometimes the violence comes from outside of the community, from gangs or warlords. But even when it comes from the outside, this violence is almost always jointly produced. That is, when the gangs or warlords come from the outside, they often don't know who the Jews are, where they live. They require locals to help them. Now, the word pogrom first came, as many of you know, speak Russian, comes from the Russian word gromit, meaning smash, break, thunder, to describe the anti-Jewish violence that broke out really in three large waves. From 1881 to 1884, from 1903 to 1905, and then from 1918 to 1920. But it's been used again. It was used again in 1941 to describe the neighbor-on-neighbor violence in the first weeks of World War II. But then scholars have appropriated it to describe anti-Jewish violence, localized anti-Jewish violence in earlier eras. As far back as Alexandria, 38 CE, when local Greeks attacked their Jewish neighbors. And of course, it's been used to describe attacks not involving Jews at all, such as anti-Chinese attacks in Indonesia in the 1960s and recurring over time. But let's stay with Jews for a moment. The pogroms, what can we say about them? Each wave was deadlier. Each wave spread, in the case of Russia and the Pale of Settlement, from larger cities to smaller towns, essentially along constructed railways. These were important events because they were picked up around the world. The Kishinev pogrom, for example, not only produced the epic poem by Bialik, the City of Slaughter, where he shamed Jews for not defending themselves, for not defending their women against localized violence. They spurred the second Aliyah. They produced the first round of Jewish self-defense, but they also spawned Jewish associational life around the world, including mass demonstrations in the US, and of course, after the Kishinev pogrom, the formation of the American Jewish Committee. But let's go back to my first question, that is, what causes a pogrom? Now, this is a really tricky problem. What could it be if not anti-Semitism? How about the rituals of humiliation, including torture, rape, looting, the forced violation of sacred space, sacred norms? What could cause all of this if not anti-Semitism? But if anti-Semitism causes pogroms, then the manifestations of the former should predict the latter. The pogroms should occur where anti-Semitism is the strongest. But, and here's where it gets tricky, most scholarship on the subject usually identifies strong anti-Semitism by what? Well, by the occurrence of pogroms. Anti-Semitism, which causes pogroms, is inferred from the existence of the pogroms itself. It's a kind of a logical circularity, and it's sometimes sort of embarrassing in the literature. Now, there's nothing wrong with a bit of circularity. It's not a disqualifying feature of social explanation. But really for me, and really what this project did, is it forced me to kind of situate anti-Semitism, that is antipathy towards Jews, in its proper causal place. Of course, we'd never see a pogrom if everybody loved Jews. But even if nobody ever loved Jews and they were universally despised, and that's kind of seems unlikely, this lack of affection or distaste would not automatically translate into intergroup violence. In the argot of sociology, we need to establish the relationship between an orientation, that is the antipathy towards Jews, and actions, that is acts of violence against them. And we shouldn't be surprised that this relationship is kind of slippery. Now, I've spent a lot of time in my career and in this paper trying to establish that link between dislike of Jews and actions, anti-Jewish violence at various points in history. The fact of the matter is there is lots and lots of anti-Semitism, but there are actually only few pogroms. So therefore, that just on its surface leads you to believe, and leads me to believe, that anti-Semitism is a necessary condition for pogroms, but it can't possibly be a sufficient one. And so what I did in the paper, and I've done in various other places, is look at various pogroms to look at this relationship. And I essentially have found, because I don't have a lot of time, two things, right? First, pogroms usually occur when state and political authority break down, right? Where the state exists, pogroms don't normally occur. That's not a perfect relationship, but it's a pretty solid one. The second one, and I think one that's even more important, is pre-existing polarization between the two communities, right? So if we look at the pogroms of 1941 that occurred in the first weeks of World War II, out of thousands of possible communities, where pogroms were most likely to occur was where Jews and their neighbors were already polarized into different political parties, different political visions of the world. Now, those two things don't exhaust the possibility for the causes of pogroms. There's economic inequality, there's war, there's all kinds of things. And I'm happy to return to those in the Q&A. But what I wanted to leave you with is really a question that I've never really fully been able to answer. And I suspect I'll spend the rest of my life trying to figure this out. The relationship between hatred and actual violence. Hatred, which is ubiquitous, and violence, which is not so ubiquitous. We need, as scholars, to be able to figure that out. And we need to be able to do that where I'm living more than ever. Thank you very much.
Oops. I think I'm on. Okay. I want to thank Scott and Sal and Kalman for including me in this project. I have learned so much from my ongoing conversations with them, as I have learned so much from Jeffrey, your chapter in the book, Doris, your chapter in the book, and all the other people who contributed to it. My chapter is on gender, and I'd like to share a little bit about that chapter with you today. My contention in the chapter is that you cannot talk about anti-Semitism without also talking about gender. That is, a culture's ideas about what men and women are and do. And I'm going to touch briefly on two things right now. First, the external discourses about Jews, that is to say, how do other people talk about Jews? And second, internal discourses by Jews about Jews. In both, I trace in this chapter, gendered images of Jews, that is Jewish men and Jewish women, reflect not only popular stereotypes, but also very broad anxieties about identity, exclusion, assimilation, power, what your place is in society. In other words, what we talk about when we talk about Jewish men and Jewish women. So first, let's look at the external discourse very briefly. When we see images that recur again and again and again of Jews in anti-Semitic discourses, these recurrent images we call tropes, they're always gendered. In other words, these images hinge on ideas about Jewish men, both as Jews and as men, or on ideas about Jewish women, both as Jews and about women. These are images that circulate in popular culture, in literature, in art, in movies and in television. And they also come up in political and social discourses. They reach across geographic, national, and cultural boundaries. They move through Europe and across the Atlantic to the Americas, and they morph as they travel. And while these recurrent images are touchstones to the way Jews are sometimes imagined and fears, they also connect to broader issues about how the other, broadly speaking, is imagined and feared. So there's a long-standing and prevalent stereotype of the Jew, I'm putting it in quotations, in Europe, and the Jewish man is imagined as effeminate, physically and morally weak, manipulative, like women were presumed to be manipulative, and at the same time, materialistic, greedy, rapacious, aggressive, and sexual appetite. And you should hear, of course, an inner contradiction there, as there often is an inner contradiction with racialized and gendered stereotypes. But one thing is clear: in the European imagination, there is something off about Jewish masculinity. The Jewish man is not quite as manly as he should be, or he's excessively manly, too much so. And this might resonate with other kinds of racialized stereotypes that we're familiar with here in North America. When those kinds of images about Jewish men circulated in European cultures, they're not simply demonstrations about how these cultures imagine Jews. They're also a vehicle for a culture to think about itself and to negotiate anxieties about social and political change. In other words, who belongs? What's an ideal citizen? What are a culture's deep values? Is there an old guard that fears it's being supplanted? If we look, for example, back at the French Revolution and at the debates and conversations that happened just before, during, and after the revolution, we see how both Jewishness and gender become woven with one another. Conversations about Jews and their place in a modernizing culture, and conversations about women and their place in a modernizing culture, they run in tandem. And if we look at these two conversations together comparatively, it helps us to understand something about how the other is seen, especially at moments of cultural anxiety. As France, for example, entered modernity and expanded its ideas of who belonged, who had rights, who was a full-fledged citizen, who was equal to whom, they debated the possibilities and ramifications of according equal rights to Jews and to women. On the cusp of liberalization, the ideal citizen is imagined as male, white, and Christian. And as social norms begin to change and the rights of citizenship are extended to people who were previously excluded, then this disrupts people's ideas of where they belong in the chain of power, what their privilege is. And in response, misogyny, homophobia, and anti-Semitism work together to defend what is perceived as a threatened body politic, with each bias fueling another bias and legitimating the other bias. And we can see this kind of dynamic at work as well today as people fear a kind of rapid social change. So that's an example of an external conversation about Jews. But now we can look at an internal conversation, tropes about Jews and gender that circulate within the Jewish community. And let's turn our attention briefly to North America. While the older European tropes about the Jewish male survived their journey across the Atlantic, that is, we still have stereotypes about effeminate Jewish men, it's in the 20th century America that a set of new stereotypes develop about Jewish femaleness. I think it's safe to assume that everybody here is familiar with some of these. For example, the Jewish mother, the princess, the Jap, right? For Jewish men in North America, wanting to acculturate, wanting to flourish, immigrant Jewish women often came to stand for the old world and for the hold of enduring Jewish values in the New World. The Jewish mother expressed the ambivalences of Jews to their traditions and the fears that if they adhere too closely to that culture, it might limit them. The Jewish mother, as you know from myriad Jewish jokes, demands your ultimate loyalty. She pulls you in through obligations and through guilt. Her love suffocates and it confines you. The stereotype of the Jap reaches back into the early 20th century, when large waves of Eastern European Jewish immigrants were a source of embarrassment to more acculturated and successful Jews, those who were already acclimated to American ways. The image of the ghetto girl symbolized all that was objectionable: loud voices, garish clothing, too much makeup. She was characterized as selfish, vulgar, materialistic, and she possessed all the undesirable habits that men feared would impede their own social mobility. These newer stereotypes link Jewishness, and womenness, and they originate within the Jewish community. Eventually, they float out to the larger community so that the dimensions of the Jewish mother, for example, or the vulgar ghetto girl or her descendants, or the Jap, become recognizable figures in North American culture more generally. We know them from literature, we know them from movies, we know them from jokes. And when I wrote for this volume, I imagined my chapter as a series of what you might call case studies on the intersection of Jewishness and gender in its confrontation with anti-Semitism, and the kinds of stereotypes, the kinds of images that that generates. I think that gender helps us understand not only anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic images, but all kinds of otherness, fears and stereotypes that feed into and emerge from cultural anxieties. And so I imagine my chapter in conversation with Jewish studies, but also in conversation with studies of other racialized groups insofar as gender has an impact on them. I also think of my chapter, as Doris pointed out, is in conversation with all the other chapters. We each wrote our chapters independently, but as you read through the book, you see that there are threads that weave through the entire book, and it no doubt is also thanks to the, let's call it the governing intellect of the three editors who pulled the best out of us in putting together this volume. I want to turn the virtual podium, as it were, over to my colleague now, Carl Ehrlich, the director of the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to everyone who has participated in today's program. This launch of this collaborative volume, Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism. And as you will all have noticed in the chats, there are links there that have been posted multiple times to how to purchase the volume, and I certainly hope that you all do purchase it. I personally, although I have not yet read the volume, I'm very excited about it and certainly look forward to reading it as soon as I can find the time. After all, anti-Semitism is a major contemporary concern of pretty much everyone within the Jewish community, and it's a concern that I think has gotten greater over the last few years as the Jewish community has confronted anti-Semitism coming both from the right and the left of the political spectrum. One thing that impressed me very much about the remarks today is the diversity of views and approaches that were articulated in just these 6 short presentations from 3 of the editors and 3 of the contributors. Not that there isn't overlap between editors and contributors. The fact that this goes back to the whole genesis of the project goes back to a perceived lack of good books that introduce the subject matter from a diversity of perspectives, I think is very important and certainly helps bring this to everyone's attention that this is a much more complex phenomenon than many people might think. The contemporary issues that are roiling both the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world in talking about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. How does one define it? What is anti-Semitism? What is not anti-Semitism? Are there differing perspectives even within the Jewish community about what anti-Semitism is or is not? These are all issues that are addressed in the book. As an ancient historian, I was very happy to see on a number of occasions during these previous remarks today, mention made of the roots of anti-Semitism going back to the ancient world, generally traced back to the Jewish well, to the experiences of the Jewish community in the Hellenistic city of Alexandria in Egypt. A theory first proposed, to the best of my knowledge, by Peter Schaeffer and Jan Assmann, but one that has, I think, proven to be very fruitful in tracing the development of a phenomenon that has changed its shape and its attitude over the centuries. Doris Bergen mentioned the fact that this is a very timely volume. I think that's quite obvious to all of us. I was also very pleased in a certain way that she mentioned the anti-Semitic and racist events that happened in Charlottesville in 2017, which affected me personally because in 2019, I found myself in Charlottesville without knowing it on the second anniversary of those riots, and was able to meet with a rabbi in Charlottesville and also with a Baptist minister there, both of whom were able to tell me about this mixture of xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism that Doris mentioned, and both of whom I brought to York University to speak about the events there about a year and a half ago or a year ago or so. Yeah, gender, images of Jews, sometimes, again, looking at what Sara said, Jews can be their own worst enemies. If I understood Sara correctly, that some of these negative stereotypes that we find about Jews in the modern world have arisen within the Jewish community itself and then been propagated and have taken root as anti-Jewish tropes outside the Jewish community is a disturbing phenomenon. So again, this is just giving a small insight into the riches that we find in this volume. So since I'm also supposed to thank everyone now, since there won't be time at the end of this session for thanks, I'd like to thank the editors of the volume, Saul Goldberg, Scott Uri, and Kalman Weiser. In addition to the three presenters we had today, Doris Bergen, Sara Horowitz, and Jeffrey Kopstein. I thank Michael Rosenthal of the Anne Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, as well as my own Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, who co-sponsored this event. And we also had a few co-sponsors. In addition to the two major sponsors, the Department of Religion at the University of Toronto, and last but certainly not least, the Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. Also providing backup for us during this session today were Sebastian Buccioni and Natasha Ricci-Fried from the University of Toronto, and Julie Feinberg-Telesnik from York University. We will now move to a Q&A activity, or the Q&A portion of the event. You will find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. You may type in your questions, and the editors and panelists will try to respond to as many of your questions as possible before we end this program at 5:30. And at this point, I'd like to turn over the podium to Saul Goldberg, one of the co-editors of the University of Toronto, who will be facilitating the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl, and to everybody else, and thanks for the audience who joined us and for sticking around. Maybe the other speakers want to join me on screen. You can unmute as maybe as necessary. The first question I feel maybe that we should take is maybe because he was my professor as an undergraduate, and it's meant to be provocative, from Gershon Hundert, who has written in parodying the question of continuity as implying a line from Alexandria to Pittsburgh does not solve the problem. Would the panelists care to comment on the question of the continuities of Jew hatred in a more nuanced way? I don't know. I have thoughts, but I don't want to take on all the questions. So Scott, I know you have thoughts about this too. So maybe, and Jeff has thoughts about it because Jeff, your piece is very relevant in some sense to this.
Jeff, do you want to start and then I'll jump in, or vice versa? I'll let you, because you wrote about Alexandria and about the Holocaust, and I'll jump in as well, or we'll speak at the same time and everyone will be frustrated.
Well, I've been attempting for a number of years now to explore whether there are in fact significant continuities over very long periods of time. And in raising questions of the cases of Alexandria or Alexandria in 38 CE or Valencia in 1391, I was in no way meaning to, of course, parody, right, anything that was going on there. But what I was trying to point to is significant continuities in history, significant continuities that lead you to be able to relate hatred to violence. And one of those, I would just point to two, right? And this goes all the way back to, let's stay with 38 CE. In 38 CE, in the violence between the Greek community and their attack on the Jewish community, one of the important things that was brought up by Claudius in his letter in 41 CE, when he tried to prevent it again, was to say, look, two things. One is Jews, you're entitled to live there, but more of you shouldn't move there, right? So the question of population size, demographic weight, and this comes up over and over again in pogroms historically. And the second thing he says to the Jews is, you Jews, you should enjoy a city, the things that you have in that city, that is, comma, not your own. So this question of political ownership of the polity comes up as far back as 38 CE. And those two factors of demographic weight and political ownership, they come up over and over again. And I don't think it's a parody to raise them. Of course, it doesn't explain everything that's similar and different between the eras. But to actually find something like that I found in my own research in 1941, as far back as antiquity, it strikes me as worth engaging. Does it capture everything? No, but we're not going to capture everything in one book on anti-Semitism. So that's my reaction to that. There are continuities. Of course, there are changes.
I'll just chime in my 2 cents, and Kalman and Saul can jump in as well, or other people certainly. I think one of the main inspirations or causes or impetuses that led me to look at this project was actually the extent to which the continuity argument or themes of continuity are so prominent in so much of the literature on anti-Semitism. Those of you who read some of the stuff I published or my article or my chapter in this volume know that I look a lot, or I've looked at Robert Wistrich, who was at Hebrew University for many years, before that at London, wrote these massive tomes looking at anti-Semitism from, I think, the penultimate volume we published was a lethal obsession, and anti-Semitism from antiquity to global jihad. And so I felt, and perhaps other people as well, is that the continuity argument was overextended in much of the literature on anti-Semitism, and really leading and producing a kind of teleological argument, looking at, again, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in the ancient period and Middle Ages, up through the early modern period that Gershon has researched wonderfully up until the Holocaust. And so I felt this volume really offered us opportunity to take a step away from the continuity school and the longue durée school, and to see what we gain by looking at it, not through anti-Semitism, not through the prism of time and historical narration and teleology, but looking at it in specific, cutting across in a different way through key concepts. And this is not the first project to do this. David Nirenberg did it 4 or 5 years ago as well. Some people think David Nirenberg succeeded in his book, Anti-Judaism. I think he succeeded certainly, but maybe he didn't convince us that continuity was not an issue. maybe something that rises up just now, and thanks to Gershon for the question and Saul for prodding us with this question, is maybe there's a difference between continuity and teleology. Maybe we can say that there's historical continuity between periods, but doesn't necessitate that things are going to develop. That's where I'm going to stop right there and let other people jump in.
I think maybe we'll move to another question. There's one here specifically, Doris, for you, but invites others, that wants to know, to what extent was Nazi anti-Semitism animated or motivated by race rather than by conglomeration of religious and cultural animosities, by the idea that Jews were members of an inferior and baleful race that pose an existential threat to other racial communities? And does race, as opposed to cultural animosity, play a role in contemporary Nazi-inspired anti-Semitism?
So this is a really interesting question that includes multiple answers in the question itself. And, thanks for that. And, I am so interested, obviously, in the role of Christianity in anti-Semitism. And if I'd have been invited to write the key concept for that chapter, I would have had even more to say about this. But to me, the actually really useful thing in working with this volume and thinking about the past and present, I thought about this in a different way in my own work, is to see that it's not an either or at all on this question. And, you could ask all those questions. So is anti-Semitism about race or religion? Answer, yes. Is it about greed or principle? Answer, yes. And to me, this is why that formula I showed about the idea plus the power plus the reality of annihilation is so important, because it creates something that I think was much more dynamic than simply looking about individual motives, because they all reinforced each other. And this is still the case. So for example, you could have people in the Nazi period who weren't particularly interested in Christianity, but they found very useful stories from, I saw another question, from the New Testament. They're like, okay, we're going to pull out that story about Jesus, clearing the temple, and we're going to use that to talk about why we're, throwing communist, cinemas out of church buildings in the Soviet Union. So you have a lot of opportunism that can graft onto religious and racial themes. And even just one last thing, in the current day, the same thing is true. You look at that Anders Breivik, is he talking about race? Is he talking about religion? He was asked at his trial, are you a Christian? He said, I'm a little bit Christian. But then he has a whole trope about defending Christian civilization. And suddenly it becomes super, super important for his argument that killing Jews and killing Muslims becomes about protecting Christianity. So I think it's precisely, again, with my key concept of Nazism that I worked on, it's precisely the merging of all those possibilities that makes Nazism such a key concept. So yeah, thanks for that question about religion.
Thanks, Doris. There's one, Sarah, that maybe I will direct to you, though I'll say something just quickly about it. We have a question about, because I'd be curious to hear, Sarah, about the gendered aspects of this, but, and because of your comments about putting your chapter in dialogue with, not only with others in the volume, but beyond the volume. We got the question of how similar or different is anti-Semitism from other identity-based racisms? For example, anti-Black and anti-Muslim. Is there anything distinctive about anti-Semitism? So I want to hear your answer. I'll just say that one of the things that went into the volume itself was putting anti-Semitism in conversation with anti-Black racism, with Islamophobia, and there are others that obviously in the gender chapter we get more generally also misogyny as a sort of a different kind of identity-based one. Homophobia I think comes up a little bit. So I think that's part of the goal, and it's actually even more than the comparative question. I would just say the interesting bits, Ivan Kalmar, our colleague, University of Toronto, wrote about Orientalism. It's not only about the comparative bits, but it's actually about the historical connections where Jews are jointly targeted with other groups. And that's where a lot of interesting things are happening in the study of anti-Semitism. So that's my little bit, but Sarah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
So I think it's really, a nice lead in, because I want to say that I've actually learned a lot from the scholarship on anti-Black racism, the gender dynamics of that, both the ways in which the Black man has been construed as being just in the North American stereotypes, just too much man, too kind of uncontrollable manhood, as opposed to the requisite manhood, which is, you know, virile but not out of control. In North America is almost at the polar opposite of the stereotype of the Jew, which is not enough masculinity, almost you might say emblemized by the circumcision, which literally attacks the manhood, as it were. So I've learned a lot by looking at conversations in Black scholarship and Africana scholarship about gender and the way in which internal stereotypes in the African community develop about women or about men, and so the way that those then are launched into the broader North American culture, and then they make their way to other continents. So I think that you see certainly similar dynamics about the racial other, and the way in which these get kind of pumped up and given you know, wind in their sails at moments of intense cultural change or cultural anxiety. I mean, I think it's no mistake, for example, that during the Obama administration, you saw a lot of growth in racist groups that then came into fruition with the past administration. I think there's a lot of fear of total upset to what was perceived as an innate power structure. And I think that those are not so dissimilar from the dynamics that I was trying to describe vis-a-vis the French Revolution. So I think that while each of those instances has its own history, its own interconnections and continuities, and kind of deserves to be studied by itself, I think the links and the strands that link them are so clear, and particularly when we look at the way in which 20th and 21st century implicates certain kinds of stereotypes of women and fear of women, and it becomes really pronounced. So I think that's a really good question.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so Anna Sternsis is supposed to be on sabbatical, but she's apparently here also writing in some questions. I'll just, this also ties into another one, and ask about the second part of her question, which is about Barry Weiss's book on anti-Semitism. So imagine someone has read that volume and then they want to learn more and turn to ours. What would surprise them the most? This is maybe, if I have it right, this is the journalist who's written a book about combating anti-Semitism recently, which I have not read, but I'm aware of. We had another question about ways to combat anti-Semitism. I feel like there'd be any number of people. Jeff, I know you wrote about anti-Semitism on campus, so I don't know if you want to say something, and Kalman, if you also maybe would want to weigh in responding to this.
Yeah, when I arrived at the, well, of course, I used to be at the University of Toronto, and when I moved to the University of California at Irvine, one of the first things that people said to me said, "Oh, this is a campus famous for anti-Semitism and pro-Palestinian student protest, most famously for Michael Oren, the ambassador from Israel to the United States, being shouted down in 2010 and not being allowed to speak." So the Jewish community insisted this is anti-Semitism. The Palestinian activists said, no, this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This is a political conflict. So I got the university here to throw a little bit of resources and to give me 3,000 randomly selected student names. And I did a survey trying to tap into, was criticism of Israel actually, how much did it overlap with anti-Semitism? To make a long story short, here's what I found. There's two interesting things that I found. There are two groups of anti-Semites on campus, or people who have stronger anti-Jewish views. There is a group that has dislike towards Jews who are also happen to be deeply anti-Israeli, right? They're there, right? It's not a gigantic group, but it's a group. It's probably about 15% of the students, right? It's there. But And here's the interesting thing. This is where it ties back into violence. There is another group of students who like Israel, right, but who are anti-Semitic. And the problem with that other group, the group that likes Israel, that's anti-Semitic, they tend to be on the Christian right, and they're armed, right? And that's the scary part. And we're going to be hearing more about this down the line, right? There is an anti-Semitism of the left and an anti-Semitism of the right. The anti-Semitism of the left, it's there, it's loud, it's absolutely, it's 100% there. It's what Barry Weiss is mostly talking about in her book. The anti-Semitism on the right, however, is also loud, but they're armed and violent, right? And my own right, speaking right now, right here from Laguna Beach, California, if I had to go back on campus tomorrow, the group that I would be most afraid of, right, would be the college Republicans, right, who've been radicalized and are, some of them are armed. And this is where we are in the United States, right? It's where we are in the United States right now. I'm not saying it will last. It is not pervasive. It's not the entire society, but that's what Barry Weiss is mostly talking about, an anti-Semitism of the left, right? And it's there, right? But it is not to be, I think, blown out of proportion to the point when we don't appreciate these smaller, but perhaps more pernicious and dangerous in the United States, at any rate, anti-Semitism of the right. Right? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Saul, I'm not sure exactly even what the question was right now, but I'll try to say something. I also haven't yet read Barry Weiss's book, although I have a sense of what it's about. Our volume does not recommend specific ways to combat anti-Semitism, but there are a few things to be said about this. I used the ideas of the volume teaching a class just last semester, and the essays were excellent for getting at precisely some of these issues, having a discussion about them. That's the first thing. Our essays about Zionism, anti-Zionism, perhaps more importantly, our essay about, and I say our, I mean belongs to the volume, about conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are part of the rhetoric of both the left and the right today, and they overlap. And that's partly what's so frightening about it all. And this helps us to understand it better. The other thing I will say is that, and this is, I'm talking, it's not in our volume, but I'm saying ideas that others I've heard say, and I agree with them, is that because particularly so many issues on the left, concerns on the left coincide with critiques of Israel. Once you start, and this ties into the ideas about conspiracy theories, once you start talking about certain things, they lead to discussions of Jewish conspiracy theories. There is a wealth of anti-Jewish ideas in Western society that people who don't consider themselves anti-Semites can grasp onto. And it's often a slippery slope. And I think our book is very useful for trying to untangle some of this business.
Doris, yeah.
I wanted to just add a little bit onto what Jeff said. It also fits with what Kalman says about the anti-Semitism on the right, because a thing that I actually took out of my talk, but because I didn't have time, was about the 6 million wasn't enough t-shirt. And you know how there was a whole thing like, okay, they someone wore that t-shirt on January 6th, but then it turns out they didn't wear the t-shirt at the January 6th insurrection. It was at a December, Proud Boys rally. And what I was thinking about is how there are so many codes in those groups, and you saw them at Charlottesville, you see them with those Proud Boys, the number 88, the number 14, the 6MWE, like there's all those codes, and they become a kind of almost like tantalizing space and site to assert the sort of fantasy of power that Nazism offers, while sort of sliding out from under the overt accusations of anti-Semitism. And for me, watching those codes and seeing the just frequency with which they are appearing in many, many different settings is incredibly alarming. So I think that's also something to look for. Like you said, Jeff, that the anti-Semitism of the left is loud. Well, it can be pretty loud on the right too, but there's also a huge amount of those like coded, and people in the know, they know exactly what that means. I might have to look up 6MWE. Well, I don't have to look it up anymore.
Thanks, Doris. I'm not sure if there will be takers for this, but we do have a few questions asking if anybody wants to comment on the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. I know that some of us have discussed this in private. I don't know if anybody wants to say something more in public about this. I'm just going to, I could direct it to someone, but yeah, Scott, go ahead.
I'll jump in at the end of the day, happily. I think the IHRA definition has come under some criticism of late from people on the left or on the Jewish left who feel that its definition of anti-Semitism, as was created several years ago and has been adopted by, I think, over 35 different countries, perhaps the number is not accurate, is too sweeping in its charges that criticism of Israel is in effect anti-Semitism. And this leads, again, back to this question about Barry Weiss's book, which I also haven't read. So that just shows you who really put this volume together, is three rather uninformed people. But Weiss is primarily concerned, from what I read of articles about the book and articles that she wrote, about anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel being a new form of anti-Semitism. And so I think, at least for me, someone living in Israel, and it's kind of ironic, and something came up quite a bit in our discussions while we put this project together, I feel that even though, or although it's certainly well-intentioned, the IHRA definition as it stands right now goes too far. And it targets and labels something as anti-Semitism, which I think simply can also be criticism of either Israel or its policies. And certainly not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. That's clear. Just as Jeff mentioned earlier, some criticism is, but not all of it is. And so I think the IHRA definition, in my opinion, goes too far. We didn't have the IHRA definition as a key concept. I think definitions of anti-Semitism is a whole nother book. And Ken Marcus, who is now at this, I think it's the Brandeis Center for Law, and I don't know what the whole title is, has written a book about the definition of anti-Semitism. This will be ongoing. But I invite my other editors and co-panelists to jump in on this. I think that's one of our main points, or one of my main points in the volume, is that one can criticize Israel and its policies and not be anti-Semitic. I think that's where the IHRA goes a bit too far.
Yeah. I'll say something about this briefly. I have fewer problems with the IHRA definition, not because I agree with it necessarily, but I think that we have to remember that what it was designed for, to tabulate numbers of statistics about anti-Semitic events that happen. It wasn't meant as a written in stone definition. But I think more importantly, people understandably tend to forget that there are caveats. They're small, but they're there. And they overlook the caveats, such as, does this kind of criticism has to be compared with criticism of other countries? It's very easy to overlook. I understand that, but I think people disregard the fact that those caveats are there.
I'll jump in.
That's all I have to say at the moment about this.
Quickly, sociologists tend to, in contemporary anti-Semitism, tend to say something like this, which I know is going to drive everybody here crazy. Say it's a multidimensional concept, which you won't disagree with, but they break it down to like four traits, right? In the United States, at any rate. And they'll say, I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them, right? Number one is hidden Jewish power. And so when you ask questions in a survey, you'll say something like, do you agree, disagree, Jews have too much power in finance? Something like that, right? The second trait is dual loyalty. Jews are more loyal to Israel or their own group than they are to the United States, right? So that's a second trait. The third one is Holocaust minimization, right? Jews talk about the Holocaust for instrumental reasons, they'll say, right? Agree, disagree. And the fourth is what you might call traditional anti-Semitism, right? Or negative. Jews are pushy, right? They're greedy, or they will, all the way to, let's say, the use of Christian blood for ritual purposes. That sometimes gets put in there too. And what we can say is that on whether it's regarding Israel, so this is where we are, to what extent people who are critical of Israel also share to some extent one of those four attitudes that I've just talked about, then we can say that there is some overlap between those two sets of orientations. Now, some of them are easier than others. If somebody asks you, Jews use Christian blood for ritual purposes, that should be an easy one to disagree with. Right? When someone asks, I mean, it's a kind of a crazy thing if you think about it. But still, at a conceptual level, we should be able to say, right? Forget about is it IRHA?
H is first. The Holocaust is before remembrance.
Yes. Okay. IHRA. That to just move away from that for just 1 second, because that's what they're trying. The attempt there is to try to say that illegitimate criticism or too much one-sided criticism of Israel amounts to anti-Semitism. What I would say is that any criticism of Israel, the person who has any criticism of Israel, to the extent that they share some of these other four views of Jews, then we're on very dangerous territory. And there I don't have a problem with, so I agree with Kalman more than I disagree.
But I mean, just to point out, and you know this quite well, Jeff, the IHRA definition is not a sociological study. It's used to define and to characterize and to potentially charge people with being and with undertaking anti-Semitic actions, or in some countries, statements.
Yeah.
And as you know quite well, in the IHRA definition, I believe 7 of the examples relate to the state of Israel, whereas your sociological examples, none of them, if I remember correctly, and it's late at night for me, no, I apologize. None of the 4 examples deal with Israel. So it's a little bit as much, and we'll have this conversation again when you come to Israel in a month. And I'd love to have it with you over a beer, hopefully. But it's a little bit of apples and oranges what you're talking about.
Yes.
Because the IHRA definition is for legal purposes, not for sociological purposes.
Well,
and that's the
it was
point.
Supposed to be, when it was originally founded, it was founded for study purposes. It was not founded for legal purposes. So one of the criticisms is that it has been adopted into law, university regulations, all those kinds of things with quasi-judicial definition of it, as opposed to, it's supposed to be used for a study definition. And for study, anything goes. The question is it more or less useful? Is it more or less helpful in helping us understand what's going on? As for legal definitions, I leave that to you sharks, to whatever you think should go. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a gigantic opinion on this, but I think it's more helpful to think of overlaps between two distinct, that are methodologically distinct sets of views.
Okay, I think we have a question also from Jim Redelack, so I'd like to include that. Bill Ayers, leader of the Weathermen, once observed that a radical is really just someone trying to get to the root of things. Thinking about Imperial Germany, would it be fair to label pan-Germans or other hyper-nationalists radical anti-Semites, because for them, getting to the root of things meant Jews should be legally prohibited from occupying any judicial post, any teaching position, any newspaper, editorial office, or any German parliament. I think this is mostly meant for the German historians here. So Jeff and Doris, I assume, are up.
Go for it, Doris.
Well, the problem is I can't hear too well, so I couldn't really hear the question. So someone else needs to start answering, or you have to repeat. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll start answering, and Doris will pick up on it immediately. The question was with whether the pan-German nationalists in the Kaiserreich, right? Could you call them radical anti-Semites, right? And my own response to that is, at a kind of an everyday speech, yeah, I throw around the word anti-Semite all the time. He's an anti-Semite, she's an anti-Semite. I do that, right? But as a scholar, right, I tend to think, and this really came to me when I did my student study. There are very few ideologically convinced anti-Semites with sophisticated, coherent worldviews. We all walk around, all of us, with prejudices and various kinds of views towards other people. And what we can say is that I'd like to think of it as more of a kind of, and to get at Jim Retalic's question, as an elastic concept, right? In which people share more or less of these kind of traits, the 4 that I talked about, but you could add more. And when we're talking about the people he's talking about, that I have no trouble believing that that subculture was deeply permeated with at least all 4 of these traits and quite possibly more. So Doris, that should help you get started.
Okay, and the interesting thing is that Jim Retallack himself could provide an excellent answer to this question that he just asked. But I will add that, I think it's super important that built into the question was the idea of policies of exclusion. And I don't know if that's like one of the attitudes on your list, but to me, that just like sets the bar down. If someone says Jews should not allow to be judges, that's an anti-Semitic policy, and the discussion is over. So then the question becomes about, again, Jim's very interesting choice of, well, does that mean they're radical anti-Semites? Well, I don't know, because, again, you played with the term radical, but I can tell you that one chapter in the book is by Richard Levy. And of course, Richard's work on anti-Semitism, very well known. And for him, he was really interested in isolating the idea of anti-Semitism as a political phenomenon in Imperial Germany, where you have literally an anti-Semitic political party that makes that its core platform, and that is something different from, say, I don't know, Christians in Germany who say, unless someone converts to Christianity, we don't think that they can be university professors. So there's definitely gradations, but the interesting thing is the emergence of a specifically political anti-Semitism, which precisely comes out of that period.
Thanks, Doris. I don't know that we have time, I guess, for a few more. Usually this goes until 5:30. We can take a few more questions if everybody is willing to stick around. And there's one, someone, Shlomi, has written in lots of questions. There's one that I'd be curious to know the answer to, that Kalman, I assume you are most equipped to answer, is just about how many languages have equivalents for anti-Semitism and how many don't. There's an entry in our volume that is not there because Kalman didn't write it, but despite my pressures to write it, about thinking about language a lot and cognates for anti-Semitism in a bunch of languages that Kalman's thought a lot about, but apparently not enough to write the entry for us. But maybe you want to use the opportunity here, Kalman, to say something about.
Sure. Yeah. And this relates to the previous remarks. It's one of the things we did in this volume is not insist on a definition of anti-Semitism because the issue is so contested. And because we agree that it's, by different contexts, our understanding of anti-Semitism is different. And the term itself only appears in the 1870s. What do you talk about? How do you talk about anti-Semitism before there was the term anti-Semitism? And is it the same thing? And is it now the same thing as it was in 1870? These are all questions that come up. My big interest was in how Jews perceive anti-Semitism. This is something that I'm working on in my book about Yiddish scholars and Nazis. Without getting too deeply into that, the short answer to the question is that Jewish vernaculars have their own terms for anti-Semitism throughout the ages, or what we would call for Jew hatred. What they meant by this and how they distinguished it from what we might call anti-Semitism today is a different thing. We actually have a very interesting article by Marty Lukshin, who's a professor emeritus of York that many of you know, about the term Sinat Yisrael, of hatred of Jews or Judaism in ancient times, in the ancient Jewish scholars, what they made of all of this, which I think is this is truly a unique contribution to the volume. Most other languages borrowed the term anti-Semitism sometime after the 1870s, at least European languages. I can't tell you about non-European languages. What I don't know the answer to is, do they have precisely, how much of a native vocabulary do they have to refer to hostility towards Jews? Or do they just have a bunch of terms that refer to Jews? Clearly they do. I certainly grew up knowing many terms from Italian to refer to Jews. such as terms for a Christ killer, that have largely gone out of fashion. And I assume that many other European languages have similar terms. But I think someone really has to go out and do a study of both Jewish vernacular terms for animosity towards Jews and what it all means to Jews, as well as non-Jewish vernacular terms for animosity towards Jews. Certainly these exist, but anti-Semitism seems to take over sometime by the 20th century.
Maybe I'll also just add in relation to the other question, sort of issues of the volume, and part of the point about definition altogether, quickly, is firstly this, that it's one question about whether there is something like the objective definition of anti-Semitism and what that definition would be. But then you could ask a follow-up question. Let's say we sort of think that there is such a definition. You could ask the question about whether the people identified by that definition would also identify themselves as anti-Semites. And that's a different question about sort of the experience of the people who are actually anti-Semites, which is one of the things that makes that German imperial context interesting, is that they were self-proclaimed anti-Semites in a way that's not as straightforward anymore. And then there's the other part of it, which is the Jewish experience of anti-Semitism and how that lines up with the objective definition of actual anti-Semitism. So this is part of what's going on in the IHRA definition. How you think about it, is it what objectively speaking anti-Semitism is, what Jews experience as anti-Semitism? There's a complicated answer to that. I think I want to say, just in relation to what Kalman was saying about Marty Lockshin's article, that piece, why it's there, is not what Sinat Israel is in itself, but about Jewish perceptions of anti-Semitism. That's what that piece does. In its own way, Scott's piece on Zionism is part of the story about the reaction to anti-Semitism too, and how Jews conceptualize anti-Semitism together with conceptualizing Zionism. And my own piece on Jewish self-hatred is part of that same story, about one of the ways Jews experience anti-Semitism and other Jews who experience anti-Semitism. So there's lots to say, I think, about all of this. I'm trying to make the plug, at least for the volume, that one of its virtues, in my opinion, is that it covers that ground. Usually in the study of anti-Semitism, it's more written from a supposedly detached perspective about what anti-Semitism really is and narrating that story. But we, I think, do a nice job of also getting people to think about what anti-Semitism is from a Jewish perspective that may not always be anti-Semitism. And that's often overlooked in the study of anti-Semitism, which in sort of a famous phrase was thought to be sort of a non-Jewish problem classically. But it's actually interesting the ways in which Jewish debates happen about what to count as anti-Semitism, how they react to it. And the volume, I think, does a good job with that. I don't know if there are other questions. We're very much near the end, and I hesitated to speak because then I lose track of this. Anthony, I will answer this. It's funny that Anthony Lerman, I don't know if this is the Anthony Lerman from England, has written about the bogus notion of Jewish self-hatred. I asked provocatively, considered relevant for this book. I can only say that you should read my chapter. I think there's lots of parts to that answer. If this is the Anthony Lerman, I think it is, then certainly you are at least briefly referenced there as part of, there are two parts. There's the history of the concept that's interesting as a social psychological phenomena that I think is more generally known in relation to other kinds of racism as internalized racism. And it's well documented in a number of communities. So you have Black self-hatred or Chinese self-hatred, or any number of other minority groups that have similar kinds of interiorized forms of racism. And then there's the whole polemic in the Jewish community about what is and isn't Jewish self-hatred. Scott, were you going to say something also about this? It looked like.
Yes, but I couldn't think of anything really intelligent to say. Other than I think that this comment that I'm not, then maybe we're assuming this is Anthony Lerman we think it is. Maybe it's another anti-Lerman. But we had these debates ourselves when we were trying to think of, okay, what are the key concepts that go into this volume? And we sat in a seminar room in Tel Aviv 5 or maybe 6 years ago. We must have started with 40 concepts or 50 concepts on the whiteboard. We had to limit it down to basically 20 to get it within one volume, which that itself took us enough time. So obviously there's some things that fell by the wayside and others that were brought in. But each concept adds a different perspective. So I think that this is just to say that we also had our own debates about this very concept and about other concepts as well. And that's part of what the volume is about debating these concepts and these views back and forth.
I'd say, especially on Jewish self-hatred, just if I may, one other word is also it's, I mean, one of the reasons it's important for the inclusion, as I explained in the chapter, is that it's a synonym for Jewish anti-Semitism. And to me, Jewish anti-Semitism cannot be explained in the way anti-Semitism is explained when it's by non-Jews. There's a special explanation needed as to why Jews share tropes that are meant to be misperception of Jews if you have somehow internalized those as members of a community. So that itself is an interesting explanatory problem. Whether I give a convincing answer, again, buy the book and then write me with all your complaints so I can fix it in the next book. But that's the quick answer. I don't know if there
So you've muted yourself.
Yeah, I saw that I got muted. Yeah, I see it's almost 5:45. So maybe I will just thank everybody for coming and really for the generous remarks, thoughtful remarks about your own work and others. So thank you. Also, again, to all the organizers, we really appreciate it. The effort by Julie, Natasha, and Sebastian, and certainly Carl, Michael, and Anna for initiating this. We're really grateful. So thanks, everyone.
Great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.